This episode of Harvey Brownstone Interviews is brought to you by the Harvey Brownstone Talk Show Blend Coffee, available at hollywoodblends.com. Everyone's saying it's the best coffee they've ever tasted. Why not give it a try and see for yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Harvey Brownstone, and today's guest is a multi-award-winning writer from New York City whose captivating and historically important book entitled Bashert, A Granddaughter's Holocaust Quest, moved me so much that I just had to invite her on the show. In this engrossing book, she tells of her search for her roots, which began in Vulchin, a town in Belarus, where her beloved grandmother came from, before creating a new life in America. Through interviews, personal testimonies, historical accounts, archival documents, and family anecdotes, the book reveals the unprecedented barbarism of the Nazis and the brutal reality of the massacres of the Jews who were living in Soviet territory occupied by the Germans after June of 1941, and before the Nazis came up with the final solution in 1942. Although most people think of concentration camps and gas chambers when they think of the Holocaust, the fact is that between 40 and 50% of the Jews killed during the Holocaust were killed by methods other than by being gassed. We're talking about savagely horrific mass murders, exterminating the Jewish populations of dozens of cities, towns, and villages by being shot in the head and then piled in mass graves in the forest. In particular, our guest uncovered the facts surrounding the massacre on September 22, 1942, of 500 Jews from the town of Voŭčyn, where her family came from, and the even more shocking and barbaric massacre of 50,000 Jews, including 9,000 children, in Brona Gora, located in a forest between Brest and Minsk. The book also deals with the refusal of the Soviets after the war to recognize and commemorate the Jewish genocide that took place on their territory. In 2021, the book was ranked at #1 on the Book Authority's list of the best Holocaust biography books of all time. And in 2023, the book received honorable mention for the Erich Hoffer Award in the category of legacy nonfiction. Our guest has also written several other books, including Esfir is Alive and Floating in the Neversink, both of which received numerous prestigious awards. Our guest has published numerous stories and essays, and she's received many prestigious literary honors, including the Ernest Hemingway First Novel Contest, 2 Dortort Creative Writing Awards, the Stark Short Fiction Prize, the Short Story Society Award, and the Authors in the Park Short Story Writing Contest. Our guest holds a Master of Fine Arts degree in creative writing from the City College of New York, where she has taught creative writing courses. She's also taught courses on how to write about your family and still talk to them afterwards. And she's even taught a course on how to write about your mother without guilt. That course led to an anthology published last year called Here's the Story, 9 Women Write Their Lives. I'm pleased and delighted to welcome Andrea Simon to our show. Andrea, thank you so much for being here.
And thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Andrea, as I mentioned in my introduction, I was very moved by your memoir, Bashert, and I want to start with the obvious question. Why did you write the book?
Well, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, was extremely original and outrageous, and she lived with us part-time, and she always told me these stories of her youth in Vulchin, of her village during the pogroms, and then coming to America with 9 children, and she had 3 husbands. So she was very colorful, and I just was very taken with her stories. And we knew we left relatives there who died during the Holocaust. I was very interested to find out what happened to them.
Some historians are saying that your book represents a new genre of Holocaust writing because the survivors are disappearing. So we're now relying on their descendants to tell the stories. Do you think your grandmother ever considered writing a book about her life and her family back in Eastern Europe?
I don't know that she had the discipline to do such a thing, but she certainly talked about it. And the stories were notorious in my family, especially when it came to her. She was very flamboyant, and she used to tell stories of how she put the white flour on her hair during the Cossacks invading her village so they should think she was an old woman. So a lot of them are centered around her own heroics. So I don't know how truthful it would have been, but it would have been interesting.
She sounds like my kind of woman, I got to tell you.
Yeah.
Now, as you know, the word Bashert in Yiddish means predestined or something that was meant to be. Why did you name the book Bashert?
Well, it also means in some religious communities, your loved one, who you were destined to marry. But I didn't mean it that way. I meant it in the old-fashioned, like fated. And I went on this trip to Eastern Europe, not knowing that I would find out much information about my grandmother's village. And coincidentally, or Bashert, I met an Israeli contingent with the one man who was from Vulchin who escaped during the war, and we met, and he told me that he knew my family. So that was my first Bashert, and then consequently, I met somebody in America who was best friends with my family. So that was the second Bashert. So I just felt that I didn't start out to really write a book, but it sort of felt right when I got all these supposedly coincidental events, and that just pointed me into feeling like I had to write it and had to name it that.
Some people say there's no such thing as a coincidence.
Possibly. I think when you're aware of something, it appears. I mean, when you're a woman and you're pregnant, all of a sudden everybody's pregnant. So I think that there was a time when people were talking about the Holocaust more. Maybe the survivors were getting older and they were telling their stories. The Shoah Foundation, started their work. And so people became more aware of these things. Some information was coming out after the fall of the Soviet Union. So a lot of that contributed to my awareness.
Now, in 1997, as you said, you traveled to the town of Vulchin and you actually saw your family's house. Can you recall how you felt when you saw that?
Well, it was also a horrible rainstorm. So we were standing, me and this guy, Shmuel, who was the Israeli Vulchiner, was pointing to, it wasn't the same house, obviously. It was the same area where the house was, because it had been rebuilt over the years. And it was also the home of a priest, I think. But he pointed out the original structure, which was sort of like a second building. And it was raining, and it was a very emotional moment. And I started imagining, as I wrote in the book, all the voices of my cousins. There were three girls who lived there, and it became a reality to me. And it was very emotional. I didn't think I had a Holocaust story because I was kind of removed, but here I was.
You wrote a 34-page account of your trip to Eastern Europe, but you said in your book that you were very reluctant to show it to your family. Why?
Maybe because I didn't know that they would be that interested, especially my mother and her generation. My mother was spent her childhood in the Voŭčyn as well. So, but she was young; she didn't remember too much. But my first reaction was, "Why do you want to write about that? You know, it's too sad. I don't want to read it." And she didn't live to see it published, but she did live to read a version of it. And she was very happy I did it. I was afraid of some of the reactions of that generation, of not wanting to dig up, excuse the expression, dig up old bad news, or just to not face it.
No, it's understandable. Now, the thing that really stands out in your book for me is the incredibly meticulous and thorough research that you did, Andrea. You went to extraordinary efforts, writing to many institutions in Poland and Belarus, asking for historical information about the town of Vulchin and the massacre at Granddaughter, but you generally received only very scant information. What do you make of that?
Well, this was the early days of the internet when you couldn't find anything. I mean, there was nothing about Vulchin, so you also had to think that it might be spelled differently. Could be Polish spelling, could be Russian spelling, could be this. So I really became more and more frustrated and more determined to find out what the information was, if there was any information. And little by little, I started getting sources from different places, either German sources, which were totally wrong. I knew their accounts of the massacre were very scanty, and Russian sources, which I had translated, which admitted to the massacre at Granddaughter, but they didn't say they were Jews because in their mind, it was, I guess they didn't want to feel culpable of anything. And also because they, as a socialist country, they felt that there should be no ethnic labeling. So they were peaceful Soviet citizens. And so and so I got so many contradictory reports, block reports, and people who said they didn't know anything, that I became very dogged because of that. That I just said, well, I'm going to find it out. And after doing this for a long time, I realized there probably is no truth. There's a lot of different accounts, and that I'm not a historian, so I can't really tell everything that happened in terms of the history of the area, but I could see that I would just tell people what I found and leave it up to them to decide.
In your book, you dealt with the often asked question of whether the Jews being led to their deaths during these mass executions were too passive and should have resisted more. In your opinion, Andrea, based on your research, is that a fair comment?
It makes me very angry, that comment. It really does. Because if you know anything about the ghettoization of the Jews, they immediately took out the able-bodied people and put them on work details, or deported them, or sent them to concentration camps, or massacred them. And the villages, but before the actual liquidation, were basically women, older people, and children. And they were not equipped to really resist too much. And also they had been ghettoized. So they were starving, and they knew they wanted to get out of the ghetto. So if somebody came along and said, we're going to take you to a better place, some of them believed it. And then there are some of the religious Jews really felt in the afterlife that God would protect them. So maybe some of those didn't protest so much. But the more you read about the Holocaust, there were a lot of resistance groups in a lot of the villages, and underground in the forest near Granddaughter. There were tremendous resistance areas. So of course the Warsaw Ghetto was, tremendous resistance, and they were unequipped to really resist everything. I mean, there are some cases where Jews resisted, or they lived with non-Jews, or they escaped. But on the whole, the more you read about it, the more you realize they did not go passively to their death.
Well, I think that's one of the most important aspects of your book because you deal with that allegation, that accusation head on, and you addressed it beautifully as you did just now. Now, although the Holocaust was primarily organized and perpetuated by the Germans, how much responsibility, in your opinion, do the non-Jews in all of these Polish towns and villages bear for collaborating in the killing of Jews who were their neighbors?
Well, complicity to me is just as bad as actual performing. And we see that today as well. I think that so many villages saw the non-Jews, saw their brethren, the Jewish neighbors, being rounded up, especially I'll talk about the Jews that were massacred, saw them being stripped of their clothing. They rummaged through their clothing and took the valuables. They took their jewelry, heard them shouting and screaming as they were being massacred. And many of the locals were complicit in digging graves, especially at Granddaughter, which the massacres happened over a number of months. I guess they were forced to, who knows, to dig graves. And so they knew it was happening. And unlike the concentration camps where people could live right next door to it and deny their existence, these people saw it happen. And I feel that I'm glad that you mentioned this, that most people are not aware of how many Jews were killed in these massacres. It's the untold story of the Holocaust. And it's a different type of complicity. It's a much more complicit situation, and something that you really have to examine the motivations of the average person.
When you read the accounts of non-Jews who spoke about what they saw and did during the liquidation of the Jews, you said
Yes.
you suspected that many of these accounts were tainted by what you called collaborator guilt. How reliable do you think these people's stories are?
I don't think that they're 100% reliable. What I did consider reliable was the testimony of the railroad workers, who took copious notes about, because most of the Jews that were killed in the massacres or even in the concentration camps were deported on trains. So the train workers, some of them had a bird's eye view of the actual massacre of Granddaughter, but they also knew how many Jews came from what villages, and they took copious notes. And I was able to find that information and have it translated. I find that something is believable because there was no motivation for them to take these notes. They weren't doing it for history. They were doing it because it was part of their job.
Are you aware of any Jews from Vulchin who were hidden by non-Jews?
No, I'm aware of some, like Hannah Kramer, who escaped before the town massacre. Even my relatives, I think they were, I found out that they were not in that massacre. So they obviously must have escaped, and they were able-bodied. So they might have been forced to do some manual labor. And it's possible they even went to Granddaughter. I just don't know. But no, I don't think that there were many, if any, that I've ever heard of.
Well, that says something right there. Now,
Yeah.
after the war, Stalin forbade any mention of Jews as the primary victims of Nazi genocide,
Yes.
and you've explained why. And that prohibition on the truth continued for nearly 50 years. Why do you think Stalin did not want it said that they were Jewish, even if they were Soviet citizens?
Well, Russia did occupy that territory in the beginning of the war, and I'm sure they were responsible for killings. Maybe they didn't want to recognize that culpability. I really don't know. I think a lot of it was the propaganda of socialism, that people should all be equal and that the workers should be, the prime people. Of course, we know that they don't they don't lead their lives that way. Certainly, Putin is not a proletariat, but that was the early philosophies of socialism. And I don't really know. I guess he didn't want to feel guilty. He didn't want to feel, he was certainly a tyrant. I mean, there were so many murders by Russians of Jewish people throughout history.
Now, the obvious question raised by your book, Andrea, for me is how was it possible to hide the deaths of 50,000 people for so many years? Did you ever get the answer to that question?
People are trying to find it out now. I don't know if you ever heard of the book Holocaust by Bullets. And there's an organization called the Together Plan from England who are they're investigating a lot of these massacre sites, digging them up to find bullets, just to prove there was some testimonies that, like from the girl Esfir, who I wrote a subsequent book about, that she was actually the only one that I could find of a verifiable, but I can't really answer that. I don't really know why.
Well, to your knowledge, were any of the perpetrators of the mass murders at Vulchin and Branagora ever prosecuted after the war?
There were some of them, I think. Yes, I don't know the exact statistics. I say some of it in the they were identified, and a lot of there was the Eisengruppen, which was the mobile killing force that the Germans provided in these areas. And they would come to these villages along with the locals and work with them. So some of those members have been identified. Many have escaped, and I think some of them were prosecuted. I don't really know that much about that aspect of it.
From what you experienced when you went to Vulchin and from the notes of others who have been there, do you think the people who are living there now even care that the Jewish community of that village was annihilated?
Well, my feeling when I went there was the guy who was like equivalent to the mayor of the village entertained us in his house, and he was very cold and dismissive of us. And we feel that he thought we came to claim our family to a house. I made it quite clear to him I wasn't ready to move to Vulchin. And so he was a little more forthcoming. But Vulchin was basically a Jewish town when my family was there. I would say, I don't know exactly the percentage, but probably 80% at least. There were some Russians and there were some Poles on either end of the town. So I did have a correspondence, which I write in the book, with one woman who was very forthcoming and wrote me, and we corresponded for a while. She told me what happened, but it was always like I was a child and I didn't really know. So it wasn't taking responsibility for it. The Israeli group went back years later and they erected a monument to the Jews in Vulchin. So I don't think they had much cooperation from the town, but there have been other people who have gone there. And so they have met them. I don't think that, aside from the few people that actually knew my relatives who are probably no longer alive, many people were that welcoming to Jewish people coming back.
I have to say that that was my experience too. A number of years ago, I went to a number of places in Poland with a group of people, some of whom were Holocaust survivors. And everyone that we met, pretty much, especially the older ones who were alive during the war, had no interest in talking about what happened to the Jews. They would say things like, "We didn't know, we knew nothing about them." When I would ask, "But these people were your neighbors and they disappeared and their homes were taken over by non Jews. Didn't you wonder what happened? Didn't you ask anybody?" There was really quite a lot of resistance to wanting to talk about it. And I just loved the term you used, collaborator guilt.
Yes. Well, as I write in the book too, when we were in this village called Mir, M-I-R, which was a very important religious Jewish town, we were in a bus and these teenagers were sitting outside and they were waving to us. And I, in my naivete, I was waving back and I got out and they gave me the Nazi salute. So I think there was a tremendous anti-Semitism still there among the population, survivor's guilt, ignorance, and I wouldn't feel comfortable living there. Let's put it this way.
No, you and me both.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, at the risk of raising your blood pressure to the roof, what do you have to say to people, Andrea, who still today deny that the Holocaust took place?
Well, I was happy to see that when I Googled Holocaust deniers, some people actually mentioned Bashert as a book to read to show that it really happened. So I feel that that was part of my reason for doing this book, was to be the counteraction to people who deny the Holocaust. Of course, I get furious and I don't talk to these people personally because I don't really know anybody who would actually have the nerve to, especially to say it to me. But I've written a lot of things to try and point it out in a rational way. But now it's happening all over again. Anti-Semitism is never really gone away. But I think when you have autocratic governments, it allows it to rise again.
Well, when you look at the current wave of anti Semitism that seems to be so prevalent across the world, I really do see your book as a valuable instrument in combating anti Semitism. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so happy to have you on the show.
Thank you. I mean, Russia, I don't know if you've heard of the Black Book. It was written originally in 1944 by two Jewish Russian writers, and it recorded those authors interviewed people, including Esfir, immediately in 1944, before the war was over, but after Russia had freed that area. And there were a lot of people who said what happened. A lot of local people. They took testimony. So there's no way that they should have denied it. They had the testimony. But this book was banned for many, many years. I don't even know if it's allowed, if it's printed in Russian. So people did try to get testimony.
We mentioned your book, Esfir is Alive, and that's based on a true story, correct?
Yes, well, from this examination in 1944, there was a Soviet commission that was formed to interview people. And she was interviewed. She was 14 at the time. And she gave about 2 or 3 paragraph testimony that she was from a town called Kobrin, which is not too far from Vulchin. And she was rounded up with her family. And she was at Brunagora and she was shot, but not seriously. And she the shootings were done in what they called sardine style. So it was body after body after body. And she was on top. And somehow, and there were a lot of soldiers around with guns and other people. She got out of that pit and ran into the woods naked and was pursued by dogs. And eventually she made it out. She pretended she was dead and she made it out and was picked up by a convent. And the implication from what she said was that the convent eventually turned her in. And she supposedly had blonde hair and blue eyes. So they almost believed her that she was Polish and not Jewish. I think that was part of it. But it was 3 paragraphs of testimony. And I thought about that for years, of how does a 13-year-old girl survive such a horrible thing? And there were some other people who said they survived, but nothing that was that credible. This was very credible. So eventually I wrote a book about what I thought happened to her.
Again, the name of the book for all of our viewers is Esfir is Alive. I highly recommend it. Well, Andrea, I have only one more question for you, and it's this. You said in your book that your primary motivation in going to Vulchin was to find something that would help explain your grandmother's personality, which you described as domineering and provocative. My question to you is, did you find what you were looking for?
I found somewhat, maybe. It's hard to explain. So many things happened to her through that, from after she left Vulchin, that could have formed her personality. You know, she came to America. She was a poor immigrant. She had 3 husbands. She had 9 children. One of them died. 2 of them died, actually, one by suicide and one in the army. And she went through a lot. So I'm sure that her experience in Voŭčyn as a young girl, having pogroms and trying to escape it, gave her some tools to survive, survival tools. And so I think I reassured myself that was probably part of the foundation. And she was the oldest girl in her family, and very much, according to her, favored by her father. And she left at a very young age. She was a teenager, and so you could see that she had guts, and to actually see the village and how she left it, I was able to visualize her life more. So yes, I would say to that question.
I'm happy about that. I think that she must have developed the roots of her resilience
Yes.
back in those early days. And I think
Yeah.
she passed it on to you.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I luckily don't have that kind of experience, but I have been through some tough times. And, you know, I hope I'm resilient. One never knows. I mean, it's hard not to be judgmental about people who commit these crimes, but we don't know what we would do, you know, if our families were threatened or whatever. You know, I try to keep that in mind so I'm not totally judgmental. You like to think you would do the right thing. You like to think, you know, so you want to survive, but you wouldn't do something against somebody else in order to survive. But luckily, we haven't been tested that far, hopefully.
And hopefully we never will. Well, Andrea, I want to thank you for writing Bashert, which immortalizes not only your grandmother and your ancestors, but you have also immortalized the Jewish victims of Vulchin and Belarus. And by doing so, you've contributed significantly to the historical record of the Holocaust, which must never be forgotten. Thank you for writing the book. And thank you so much for taking the time to appear on our show.
And thank you for being so thorough and kind.
Our guest has been author Andrea Simon, whose book, Bashert, A Granddaughter's Holocaust Quest, is available on Amazon and wherever books are sold. For more information about Miss Simon and her other books and writings, please visit her official website, andreasimon.net. My name is Harvey Brownstone. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time. Thank you to my producers, Steve Silver, my managers, Rick Marcelli and Robin Bragg Marcelli of the Marcelli Company in Hollywood, my director of programming, Robert Monaghan, my editor, Isaiah Sheralampidis, and my entire team at the XPTV1 network in the UK.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out all the great interviews on the Harvey Brownstone Interviews YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when new videos are posted.